channel. If you are here joining us live, leave a comment in the chat box and say hi. If you're new here, I'm Vanessa, and I'm a YA fantasy, paranormal, and horror writer and book publisher. And on this channel, I talk about books, writing, and all things related to storytelling. And today's live stream is part of my monthly Writing Diversity series. This is a series I created to help writers learn how to write diverse characters. So for today's live stream, I'm chatting with Jodi Brushia. Am I saying that right? Did I pronounce it right?
Yes, it's one of those regional names. Up north, they say Burshi, but in the Southwest, they say Burche. So
Okay.
Either works.
Well, thank you. And we are going to be talking about Indigenous people and what writers should know when creating Indigenous characters. So Jodi, if you want to say hi and give like a brief introduction of yourself.
Gawatsi Zucchini, which is hello, friends, and welcome. It's great to see you today in our virtual world over here. Behind me is the Pueblo of Laguna, and let's see. I am Laguna Pueblo. I'm Diné. I'm Assiniboine and Sioux, and I'm Hunkpapa Lakota. Assiniboine and Sioux in the Hunkpapa Lakota. So I have the northern tribes and southern tribes from both of my parents, and that's who I am in a nutshell.
Awesome. So before we get started, and I do want to pull up, we have someone in the chat with us. So hi, Alicia. Thanks for joining us today. So before we get started, one quick disclaimer. You guys know if you've seen my live streams before, I always start with this disclaimer. But I want to remind everyone watching that no group is ever a monolith. And Jodi is here graciously sharing with us her experience as someone from an Indigenous background. And hopefully that will help other writers out there who are writing characters that are from Indigenous backgrounds. But keep in mind that her experience do not represent everyone who is Indigenous. So always make sure you do your research and get sensitivity readers for your stories. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we can jump into the questions. I'm going to start off with some vocabulary and terms because I know words change over the years, and I want to make sure we're all aware of the proper terms we should be using. And so my first question here is, can you share what it means when someone uses the term Indigenous person?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And thank you for that disclaimer too. You're exactly right that there are so many unique, there are over 500 tribes and I only represent some of them. And I only represent me really, and then I could talk about some of those pieces. So I thank you for that disclaimer. And when people use the term Indigenous person, I think that's a really a respectful term, because I think it really it recognizes the fact that people come from certain areas of what is now known as the United States and other places throughout the world. And so I think that's really important. And it really gives an opportunity for people to discuss like their specific tribes. Like at the beginning of my introduction, I said that I was 4 different tribes. And that's important because the more that we can be as specific as possible and not just say that we're part of like, say, like the American Indian community or something, I think that we can just say that, this is the tribe that I'm part of and all of that, which is a huge connection to people's own personal representation and then their representation within like a larger community.
Yeah. So then when referring to someone or speaking about Indigenous people, Can you share what are some terms that are acceptable to use and which ones are not or no longer acceptable? So I know you just kind of mentioned Native American. Um, so is that still acceptable to use?
Sure. And I think it's an opportunity for people to really so say if people only know somebody to be like American Indian or Native American or any of those different terms, it gives people an opportunity to be to specifically state which tribe they are from. And so I think of it as a learning opportunity, not for people just to be angry and upset about various different terms, because the people that are um, perhaps using those different terms, like they don't intend to be offensive, and so it provides an opportunity for people to talk about their particular tribes.
Yeah. So then is it preferable to use, like, if you know someone's specific tribe, is it preferable to use their tribe name?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. So I know in some marginalized communities, um, they've reclaimed terms that have been used against them in the past as a slur. Are there any terms that Indigenous people have reclaimed and it's only acceptable for them to say?
What a fantastic question. I think the more that say like indigenous tribes and communities here within what we now know as the United States and then around the world, I think it's, there's been like a huge movement over like the past 20, 25, 30 years, probably longer than that, that, the local people who are from those different communities and tribes and pueblos, they've been using these terms all along. And so coming back to using those terms, like recently, the Tohono O'otham have reclaimed their own name of Tohono O'otham and merged away from what was previously known as the Papago. And so, the Papago was like one of those enforced derogatory um, terms that like the federal government used to like what they knew at the time to define a certain group of people in southern Arizona. And it's like, well, okay, people are using that to a degree, yet the actual people from that community have always used the term, for example, Tohono O'otham. And so now, like more and more people are becoming more and more familiar, and they are becoming much more comfortable using those different names, like the actual real names. And you can see it so much of the time here in New Mexico. Some of the pueblos are used, like they're going back to using like their actual real names that they've been using all along. But during these points of like enforced colonization, they weren't necessarily as comfortable using those, and perhaps like the people themselves from that community, but also the enforcers of different names. And so there's much more of a comfort and like a familiarity of people using like their real tribal names and their real terms.
Yeah, that's cool.
It is really cool to see it happen.
Huh. Um, Now, you said you're part of four tribes? Was it four or five? Four. Okay.
Four,
So,
yeah.
um, I I had originally had it listed as five, so scratch that part here. But I was going to ask, can you share what it's like being a part of those different tribes and what makes each one special?
Sure, absolutely. And the ones that can kind of so like Assiniboine Sioux, they it's just it's used, I guess there isn't an a end or like a comma in between them. It's just like, and that's what I was talking about earlier about it being regional. So like my last name, which along with many other last names, these surnames are part of like colonized names. And so I'm sure like the original name wasn't like a French Canadian name. yet that is part of my history and a part of like so many of people's history about colonization, about people bringing in and enforcing names and beliefs and all these other things that people have as part of their history. And so being part of these different tribes, being part of Pueblo and then Laguna from my mom's side, and then being a Assiniboine Sioux, which is a Assiniboine is a certain band of Sioux. So there's different tribes and then Pueblos. And so up north, they have different bands, where here in the South, there would be Pueblos and then tribes. And so there's so many beautiful parts about how there's representation and where people are actually from, and so all of that. And I would say that it's been a real blessing to be part of these different tribes and then communities to learn all these different things that um, that people can constantly keep learning about their own community and history. So for example, yesterday my daughter, she was asking questions about like um, male things and then female things and about people speaking about like one thing or another. And it was great because it was really an opportunity to talk about how um, people that are male, they use like a certain way of speaking, and people that identify as female use a certain way of speaking. So I think that it's just really really interesting looking at all those different pieces of where people come from and all of that.
Speaking of differences in the way people speak based on gender, um, I didn't have this question in here, but I just thought of it as you were sharing. What in uh, in the different indigenous communities and tribes, is there any gender neutral terms for people who are non-binary or gender fluid?
That is such a great question. You know, there probably are, yet historically it's been usually male and then female. And I know that there are terms. I'm just not really familiar with like how they would be termed and then spoken. So that is such a great question that I know that people and people have these answers, and I look forward to talking with people that know these answers, and then to learning about that.
Yeah. Um, Another question I kind of thought of going off of that was something I saw in a movie one time. I forget the name of the movie, but in the movie there was a character, um, and they talked about them being two spirit, um, I guess two spirit person. And I was just wondering, is that something that's part of one of your tribes? And if so, if you could explain what that means.
That is a great question, and I wish I had the answer. I mean, I know some people that can speak about that in a like are much more comfortable speaking about that because they have the knowledge that can go along with that. Um, I've heard people talk about, you know, our two spirit community. I don't know how that would be termed or anything. And I know that each tribe and community does have some terms for gender neutral or two spirit people. Yes,
Awesome. Well, this is just, I guess, a reminder for everyone. This is why we say, make sure you do your research and
yes,
talk to people in the communities that you want to write about.
absolutely.
Cool. So let's see. My next question here was, so the different tribes that you are a part of, can you share what some of the similarities and differences are between each tribe?
Sure, absolutely. So for the Navajo or the Diné tribe, and then the Pueblo people, so they've been historically rivals, yet also friends because we're so close to each other. Yet some of the things that we do share definitely show up, many different forms. One of them is food. So there can be foods that can be shared amongst different tribes and pueblos that people are like, oh, okay, we have some of that, or we have some of that. So it's just great being able to experience some of those different types of foods. And in terms of the ones up north, I've had some of the foods that have been made up north. Yet I know there's so many more historical pieces as of why that came about. But I know that one of the examples that like most tribes do share because of that shared experience of colonization is fry bread, which was one of those things, that one of those foods that was used. It was like the scraps. It was like the leftovers of what. So when there was like the enforcement during colonization, that people were like, well, you're just going to be given water, lard, flour, and like baking soda, and so you can make something out of this, or you can starve. And so what tribes and communities did do over, which has been a wonderful point of being like showing the resilient parts of tribes and communities, is about learning to make fry bread, for example. They made it, and they survived, and we are still here today, and just using and utilizing what was around people. To There was just these scraps, and making it something that people actually survived on.
Wow. Um, so I know you started mentioning this a little bit, but do you know which regions or what part of the Americas that each of your tribe is originally from?
We were we were here. Let's see, the Navajo people, they were marched around in different areas, yet still within Arizona and New Mexico. And so those lines that we currently know as state lines, global lines, all those different points of like jurisdiction, those are what we have today. Yet people have been here for since time immemorial. And so I know that the Pueblo Navajo people, that we are still from this particular area, and the northern tribes are still from where they were. It's a little different than tribes that were moved to say like the state of Oklahoma, where a lot of different people were like forced to go there. So there are so many tribes within Oklahoma that they're still there making it work. And thankfully that they are. Yeah, that is part of their history of being moved from their own homelands to the state of Oklahoma. And I'm not knocking Oklahoma. It's just that they've really that may have been where they were originally, but they've also been moved there historically.
Yeah. Um, let's see here. So I had this question, and I know at the beginning you kind of started off with your introduction saying hi in another language. Um, what can you remind me one more time what that language was that you used?
Oh, sure. I said Gawatsi zucchini. And so Gawatsi is a pretty like standard greeting, and it's just like hello to people. And then zucchini is more like friends, as you can also say Gawatsi Sihopa. And you can say, so people that you actually know, um, like in a community setting. So they can be, those are just some regular greetings to just say hi, hello, and see you later. And then if somebody is say going through like a hard time, or they need encouragement, or you're like just go ahead and go for it, and just encouraging people, you could say go me, go me, and just and it's encouraging people to say, on one hand that I love you, and the other hand that I know that you can do this. And so, and whatever the different situation is.
So that goes along with this question that I had was, for all the different tribes, are there like different language spoken within each, and how are you fluent in some of them, all of them, just one?
That is a great question. I guess the first part of it, so each tribe has their own language. There are some similarities between like language families. So they can be, so for example, like the Athabascan language family, that one stretches all the way from like where we know the Alaska region to be, or the state of Alaska now, all the way through South America. So it includes so many different language families, so many different tribes and communities. So there are some similarities there. Yet, and people can understand each other. Yet they do say things differently, and somewhat in very small ways and in very different ways. And so there are some similarities there, and there are some differences. And I wouldn't say that I'm fluent in any of them. I'm more of like a passive bilingual. So I can understand the languages when they're being spoken, and when they're being written out, and I can say, oh, okay, so this is what they're saying. Yet I'm not as comfortable speaking them, and I try as much as possible. Yet I am definitely there. There are so many more people that are able to be fluent, and it's so beautiful hearing people that are able to be bilingual, and
Mhm.
definitely going in between like these different languages and being able to speak English fluently, and then to speak their own native heritage languages fluently, and just interchange back and forth. And
Yes.
so seeing some of that, or and hearing some of it.
Uh, that actually reminds me of our language in Haiti. We have Creole, which has like um, a mix, a dialect mix of French, English, Spanish, and other African languages. And so, you can kind of, there's a lot of similarity with the French words in French that are the same in Creole. And, one of my friends who is Mexican, she's like, oh, I know that word because it's the same in Spanish. And so it's like,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yes,
Uh,
that is so true.
yeah. Um, I have Alicia here had a question and asked, would you say that the differences in language are like different dialects?
Yes, in some tribes, yes. In some tribes, it is different. So, for example, if they're part of the same language community, um, so for example, and I can share this map with you later. Here in New Mexico, there are different language communities where people can understand each other, because in the southern pueblos they might speak the same language as the northern pueblos, but there might be like a dialect difference there, so they can understand each other. Yet, say for example, if people are speaking the Keres language here in New Mexico, it's very different than say like the Navajo language in Arizona, in some parts of New Mexico. So they're all very tribe specific. It all depends upon what that the particular tribe is saying.
Oh, so my other question was, I know you said you grew up on the reservation in Arizona. So can you just share a little bit about what it was like growing up on a reservation, and how it might look different for Indigenous kids that don't grow up on reservations?
That is such a great question. Well, to go along with the disclaimer that you had previously, I know that my experience growing up on the reservation could be very different from people that grew up on like on another reservation. I grew up on the Tohono O'otham reservation, which pretty much saddles the what we know now is like the U.S. Mexico border. And so I was there for about uh, 15 years, and then I was in Tucson, Arizona, for about another I forget how many years I was there, and it was just great. And I think that I learned. I was definitely learning so much, and I know that I'm still learning today about many different tribes and the things that I experienced. Yet what I do know is I I fell in love with the people in that community, and they were part of my other home community. And thankfully, to different social network places, that we can still kind of like joke back and forth within like real time to a degree. And I think back on the people that I knew back in like grade school, and thinking about all of that there. And then, I knew that at the same time I wanted to be back in my home community, which was my primary reason to moving out here to New Mexico. And I wanted to be closer to my home community of the Laguna Pueblo. And so that's what prompted me to move out here.
Um, so in within the different tribes and communities, are there any special traditions or ceremonies or rites of passages for kids that they go through? And did you and your family engage or participate in any of that?
That is such a great question. Thank you. I know that so the rites of passage and those different types of ceremonies, those definitely correspond with different points of life. So, for example, each tribe has their own particular ceremony that corresponds with those different rites of passage. So, there's puberty ceremonies. There are many different types of like healing ceremonies, and it's very specific to that particular tribe and the community. And so I know that there's one within the Navajo community, of a puberty ceremony, when people go through a kinalda, excuse me, where they get a chance to learn different things. They go through grinding corn, and they run a certain amount of time, which represent the things that they plan to run throughout life. And so there's so many different aspects of what goes along with like different points in one's life.
Were there any that you did growing up that you um, can kind of share about like your experience of what that was like for you?
I had, let's see, I know that when we lived up north, up in Montana, we definitely experienced some of the different things there, and I participated in some of those early young kid like jingle dress dancing when I was a child. And then but after we moved to the Southwest, I didn't participate, I mean, in those particular things. So I didn't go through those particular rites. I mean, I did go through those different times in my life, but there wasn't a ceremony that corresponded with what I was experiencing.
Okay. Uh, let's see. My next question kind of goes along with this one, along the same track as this, but were there any like special holidays that you and your family observed?
That is such a great question. I know that we so that really So going along with like special holidays really corresponds with people that grew up a certain way, especially in their home communities. So there's a lot of different things that go on within like regular home communities. Like people might have like a gathering in one way or another, or they might go together to like pray in like one way or another, just as like other families do. Yet with the experience of say like Christianity and other forms of like religions, people really did a form of like syncretism where they like blended a lot of this, and you can see this represented in many different pueblos, tribes, bands, where there's a big influence of say like the Christian and the Catholic Church, which this might be getting a little bit deeper into what you were asking. Yet in terms of like the special holidays that the families observe, I think it really depends upon how they were necessarily raised and if they were in their particular home community.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads me into what my next question was going to be. Is just, can you share a bit about the spiritual practices of the tribes you're in?
That talking about the spiritual practices is more about, I believe if people practice them in their own home communities, they can speak about that. I because I'm not representing um, like a let's see, let me back up. And so I don't know how much I can say about the spiritual practices of like a certain tribe or community, because it really entails going along with like people going into like the physical place of like a church or um, in like a or like a kiva or in different places of that sort. So I think that just, I mean, if somebody is talking to somebody one on one, that would be very very different, and they can speak to somebody about that. So if anybody in your community wants to talk directly, I can share with that perhaps like off camera, and we just and we can do it that way.
Okay. Um, so let's see. Um, my next question here. So I know, we all know that historically, Indigenous people have not been treated fairly at all, and they've been victims of all kinds of horrible crimes. And thanks to Disney, they're not, always seen as civilized, or they're seen as uncivilized. Um, but in your experience, how do you think uh, today Indigenous people are perceived by others?
That is such a great question. Talking about the representation that goes along with that is so important, and I think when people are able to just ask questions or one another, and they're not and they know the other person well, like it's just like a regular person that could say, oh, what about this, or and they just can just ask directly. I think that'll be great, because um otherwise when that doesn't happen, ideas of like what you were saying earlier about like the uncivilized or the uncivilized person, that say old Western movies would like perpetuate, and it's just like, no, it's not like that. One, there's not just like one particular tribe. There's many different tribes in different communities, and yet what people have seen only in movies is just that. They've just seen like these static ideas of what people are, and there's so many more layers and all of that, that people, when people get a chance to know them, when they know other people, they could say, oh, I know so and so who is part of these particular tribes, and but they know that person more than just something else that somebody has been told that they are.
Yeah. Um, and I think it just takes away some of that, the fear. Everyone kind of has a fear of what they don't know, they don't understand.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, Alicia said she would be interested in having a conversation off camera with you. So
Wonderful. That'd be great.
um, I will get Alicia's email after this and put you guys in contact.
Okay, that sounds great.
Let's see. So the next question going along with this is, have you experienced any type of discrimination or microaggressions because of your Indigenous background? And if so, how have you dealt with it?
Wonderful. Thank you. I think more so I've experienced those things, but more of like they haven't been like an overt sort of thing. So for example, when I was in high school, which wasn't that long ago, although my daughter seems to think that it was a super long time ago, um, there was in my biology class the science teacher, he's like, oh, I have real Native American bones in there. And in retrospect, I was like, whoa, that was, a crazy thing to have because that could be somebody's relative, versus like he had this idea that people were gone and not actually here. And I was like, well, that doesn't really make sense because I'm right here. And I didn't realize how offensive it actually was until years later when I was thinking about some different things and it just sort of hit me like that part. And I was just like, wow, that was pretty intense. And that's been like similar to my other experiences. They've been sort of like it hasn't been like any of like these overt sort of experiences where people have been like blatantly trying to like do one thing or another. It's been more of like a covert way of saying, oh, I think it's this or it's that. It's been like an underhanded way of like trying to be like offensive, and it's been a really interesting thing because as I've grown and become older, just thinking about that, I'm thinking like, wow, was that what they intended to mean? And then, just which has gone on to like have some really great deep conversations about things because I know so many people that I've experienced like some very like overt and in your face really um, real forms of like say the discrimination, but I haven't necessarily faced that. I've been it's been more of like a covert way of dealing with things, and I'm thinking, okay, so just needing to make sure that things have been and just asking people like, what did you really mean by that? And then come to find out that that's not what people really meant, and it provided like really great avenues for really good conversations about things, and and I think the more representation that we do have, like positive representation, people will not be as fearful that, a lot of fear just coincides with like representation where people or with discrimination, excuse me. And people will want to discriminate against people because they're afraid of like one thing or another. And I think the more that we have like some real some real conversations about these things and I think the other thing too is that as more and more people obtain Western education, like they're getting their bachelor's degrees, they're getting their master's degrees, excuse me, and they're getting their doctoral degrees. It's not as a foreign thing to people anymore, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is part of what people do, and it's very possible, and I think that definitely helps with all these microaggressions like you have in your question that are pretty much carried around, and people, if they don't know better, like Maya Angelou has said, that do what you can until you know better. And of course, that's a loose paraphrase, yet, and it's so true, because that just goes across with many different examples of things. Like, people know a certain amount of thing, yet as they grow and they choose to learn more, that can actually help people do better and help to think better and then more.
Something I kind of just thought about as you were sharing all of that, when you were talking about your teacher and having he had these poems that he talked about. And I don't know if this is something you can share here, or if it's more of a one-on-one conversation type of thing. So don't feel like you have to answer. But I was just wondering what view do Indigenous tribes take of death and what happens after we die?
That is such a great question. And people have been talking about that question, and it's been, well, maybe not that particular question, but talking about the concept of like life and about death. Usually the discussion of death is very like taboo, and that can go along with like any other particular tribe or community. And it's just something that people don't necessarily want to talk about. And there's usually things that correspond with it, like it's just not the right audience or the right time and all of that. Yet the thing is like that is part of life. That people do experience that, and it's been one of those things that people have been talking about more, and I think it's become less of a taboo topic because people are talking about it more, and not in like in a disrespectful way. Yet people are open to having that conversation, and I think previously it wasn't as talked about as much, even though it was certainly happening.
Yeah. Let's see. I see a couple of things here from Alicia. With the understanding that you are only speaking from your own experience, do you have any ways that you wish white or white passing people would ally in these moments of discrimination?
That is such a great question, Alicia. Thank you for asking that. I think one of the ways that people can just say, that they actually get a chance to know someone genuinely, I think that would definitely help with allies being allies, and not just trying to be um, to support people like in sort of like a goodwill way, or wanting to be part of like, oh, I have some Native American friends, or I have African American friends, or whatever the group is. That we see that so much at the time, and people are like, oh, I have so and so friend, and it's like it's so much more than that. It's about knowing the actual person as an actual person. And so I think that would really help people to answer your question, and to deepen on understanding about that, and to um, and to just make that possible, because I think that you know people do want to potentially, not of course not all people, but people that might be white or white passing, that um, that's just part of, that's just life, and that's just not anything that people that's grouping another group into like another group, that it's just like, well, that's not really who they are. Like, oh, they're a white friend, and it's just like, well, first they're my friend, and then they happen to be this particular race. And so I think if we just look at that and talk about people like one to one, like you had mentioned, Alicia, but wanted to have like a conversation off camera. That is fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting to know as many people as possible, and just so that people aren't afraid of asking me these questions. And I'm so glad that you did ask that question, because it's one of those questions that people want to ask, but they're not sure how to do it. So I thank you for being brave and for stepping up.
Yeah. Um, And she also said, love the quote from the poet during this National Poetry Month. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Maya Angelou was so incredible. She is just an amazing writer that I think that, just listening to her poetry, and we just finished talking about poetry in my English 102 class, and just talking, and there's no way that you could break poetry down to just like a couple of weeks, yet, this is part of what we're doing. And so yes.
Yeah. So my next question I wanted to ask, I know you do advocacy work and you work to bring awareness to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I wanted to ask if you can share more about that and what it's been like for you trying to raise this awareness.
Thank you for that question. Yes, our relatives that have unfortunately experienced, that have been impacted by being either a missing person and made their way back to their families and communities, or their relatives of the people that have relatives that are still missing. It's just a really, it is a it is a horrible reality that being able to raise awareness at the different institutions that I get a chance to work with, and work with these students that I get a chance to work with, is, I think, really important, because it's one of those discussions that we actually need to have, that having the discussion about the fact that our relatives, they are being missing, or that they are being murdered and they are going missing, is a conversation that we do need to have, because it is a reality. And I think the more that we have these conversations, these real conversations, especially in safe settings, such as, believe it or not, classrooms, which can be safe settings, or they should be safe settings, that we can have them there within, like, some academic institutions, is really what I've been able to do, and to work with other community-based grassroots people to make some things happen. And I wouldn't want to do it any other way. And just what's really guided this process has been able to, like, pray about it, to just pray and figure out, like, well, which direction should we go next? Who should we include as in part of talking about this? Which type of data should we share? Should we share data? Um, what is the most appropriate way of talking about this and having these conversations? And so I think, definitely praying about it and being part of raising some awareness at schools and places where people, go to get their classes taken care of. That's where, um, that's where this is, and it's different than people that are, like, marching, and making and being very visual in that way. Yet it's also really important to do it this way too.
Is there any, for those watching or who watch later on, do you have any suggestions if people want to get involved and help with this issue? Are there ways that they can do that?
Absolutely, definitely. I think figuring out who you can advocate with, who you can link arms with, essentially, and bring this awareness. I mean, if you feel like you can be, if you want to pull up a horn and make an announcement, that is up to you. And if you feel like you want to be the grant writer or somebody in the background of making stuff happen, um, you need to go with that. And I think just reaching out and finding out, what you need to do. You're welcome to ask me, and I can either put you in contact with people that are here locally, that are doing some things locally here in New Mexico, or people that are doing things in other communities. We can figure it out.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So the next question I had, this is mainly a question for me because I love learning about fairy tales and mythology and folklores from different cultures. And so I was wondering if you can share any of your favorite fairy tales, mythology, or folklore that you have from your tribes.
Oh, that is such a great question. I was trying to find when you sent these questions the other week, I was trying to find something that I could share here, and there's so much of it that corresponds with just like regular life lessons. I remember so many different things about, say, like cooking or about taking care of animals that um, that I learned a great deal, but they don't necessarily coincide with like a fairy tale or being part of like folklore or mythology. It's just part of like life. Like if like you learn one thing, you're like, okay, I'm not gonna do that again because I burned myself doing that, or I got a splinter doing doing those types of things.
Mhm.
But none of it has been like things that have been passed along. I mean, there have been wise things that have been passed along, but it's been more of like um, larger life lessons that I didn't necessarily experience beyond not doing something in that particular way again.
Yeah. Are there any with like any that you can think of that have specifically for Indigenous people um, uh, creation stories around like mythological creatures like mermaids or fairies or different type of myth creatures?
You know, that is such a great question, and there probably are some. I didn't hear any as I was growing up. It was just sort of just don't do that again or whatever it was. And so, but I'm sure that there are some ideas of like fairy tales or like myths that like those like allegorical tales that can go along with teaching people some sort of like life lesson. um but I'm so sorry that I don't have anything of that sort.
That's okay. That's okay. I just thought I'd ask because I'm always interested in learning about other cultures, mythologies. Like right now, for a story that I've been doing some research on kitsunes, which are in Japanese culture. So it's fun learning about
Yeah.
it.
Yes, it is certainly fun, you're right.
Um, let's see. Uh, I think Alicia says, I know that the red handprint across the mouth is often the symbol used to bring awareness to the cases of murdered and missing. Can you explain the significance?
Absolutely, thank you for that, Alicia. Your question definitely focuses in on the actual reason for it. So when people see that symbolism of like the red handprint again across someone's face, and whatever it is, if people are playing like a basketball game, if they're speaking at a summit, if they're doing one thing or another, I think that is definitely the representation that also brings the awareness of MMIW, or missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous people. And so I think the more and more people make the connection that you did of seeing that the red handprint and knowing that that's what it stands for, that's what needs to happen. So I think that it's been an effective route of talking about this and raising the awareness. And I think it brings the awareness to people's mind, because if they're not part of those communities where their relatives have gone missing, that they don't it's one of those out of sight, out of mind things. So they're like, oh, this doesn't impact me directly, so I don't. So it's not something that's actually happening. And I'm not saying this for you, but I think for for other people that are potentially thinking like, oh, this isn't really happening because it's not happening to me. Um, I think that definitely helps with that because it's part of a real life reality situation that many families and communities are certainly part of.
Yeah, and it's something that can happen to anyone. So it's good to that we all work together on it.
Exactly.
Um, let's see. Someone else joined our live here. Pamela, hi Pamela, said, "What inspired you to become an author?" Um, for me, I've always liked stories. I've always been a storyteller. My mom was always like, you know, as a kid, I always had a story to tell and I would never shut up. And so I lived in my imagination. So it just came natural for me, I guess. Um, let's see. And Alicia said, Vanessa, you would ask about mermaids. I'm pretty sure that's her favorite. It is my favorite mythological creatures, which is why I wanted to ask.
Yes. Mermaids
And
are great. I'm waiting for people to write a story about manatees because manatees are awesome. But I haven't seen many stories about manatees.
the only time I've really heard about manatees is like in relation to kind of mermaid stories. So I don't know. Alicia also said, I would also guess that different tribes have different mythologies as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's not necessarily. I think some people might call it mythologies, but it's also along with like their creation stories, because it's just one of those things. And people were asking like, well, who were the first men and women, or that they were born? And I was like, well, it really depends upon your own belief system. So some people that believe in like, say, Christianity, they'll say Adam and Eve. Yet people that have, if they believe in like the the creation stories from certain tribes and communities, that's the creation story, but like that explains where people came from. And so some might call it mythology, and sometimes it might be, but it's also creation stories that people have that are certainly true. And certainly there's no creation story that is better or less than like another creation story. That's just how it is. Just like
Yeah.
there's other belief systems and other religions.
Yeah. Um, so my next question I had here is, what do you think um, writers, in your opinion, what do you think writers usually get wrong when writing an Indigenous character?
Thank you. That is a great question. And I think people, they'll tend to group like, they'll say, oh, this person is just a Native American character, and not recognize the fact that they're part of like many different tribes. So say if they're writing like a particular character, that they're not going to focus in on the fact that like this character is from like a particular tribe. Recently, like the American Doll series has done a really good job of doing that, saying like, oh, okay, so yeah, there are different tribes, but this is a character from this particular tribe. And so that's been a real like a refreshing thing, because you're used to just seeing like a bunch of cowboy and Indian type things, of like everything from the past. And it's like, well, no, there's a modern version of like those of us that are here within like 2022, all of us that are here within 2022, that are still doing things and making stuff happen. And we're not part of the old West that has that isn't here anymore, that have like all the Indians have died off. And I think that's where characters are sort of like, or writers are creating characters that are just like these old representations of like somebody that used to be around, and it's just like, no, we're still here. And so, and I think that's one of the things that writers can definitely change, is they're looking at ideas of like who characters can be.
Yeah. Especially if they're writing a contemporary, I would think.
Yes. Right.
Let's see. Another question I had was, what? Let me see. Yeah. So, what do you really want writers to know when writing an Indigenous character? What should they keep in mind, and like what stereotypes do they need to be aware of?
Absolutely. And I think the answer to that goes along with like your initial, you know, the exhortation, excuse me, of like encouraging people to do their homework. So I think when people think of like just like, oh, let me write a native character, it's like, well, what native character, like what tribes are there, as that native character from, and who are they representing now, and what are they doing now? And so it's just because there's just like anybody, there's so many layers and complex parts, that make up a person, that is certainly one of the things that people need to think about when they are writing an Indigenous character. And that it's not just one static idea of like who that character is, but there's so many layers and pieces to it. So it definitely coincides with the need to do your homework. And, you know, just like you had said, that nobody is a monolith. And so I think that was a great idea to start off with, because I can share as much as I can about like my experience, yet, and I think it's really important, for imperative really, that people do their homework and find out what they want to include.
Yeah. Um, and definitely, think about what it is, you know, what their story is and why they're including it. Because one thing I always say is, don't just throw in a marginalized character just so you can say your book is diverse. You have to do your homework and put in the effort to make them real.
Absolutely, that is so important. And people do that. They're like, oh, I have so and so, like I have a I have a native friend, or I have a black friend, or I have an Asian friend. It's like, okay, let's just stop that right there. Like, who are these people that you're including as your friends? Are you just tossing them in, like you're saying, or are they actual people to you? And so I think that really makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Let's see. So what? And I have two questions left. So if anyone is in the live watching and you have any more questions, I know Alicia has been asking some along the way. But if anyone has any other questions they want to drop into the chat box, we'll do a quick Q&A after these last two questions. So my next one was, let's see, in your opinion, why do you think it's important for writers who are writing these characters to do their research and approach the topic with sensitivity, and what kind of impact or harm can occur if they don't?
That is such a great question. I think people don't intend to be harmful in their writing. I mean, most people don't intend to be harmful. I'm sure there's some people that are going to try to sneak something in there, but that's not the usual case. So I think when people do their homework and they're doing their research to find out about why this person is the way that they are, I think that would really help them to to steer away from like inflicting any sort of harm. Although harm can definitely come in any sense, even if people are not intending to do that. So I think it just really, I think when people do their homework, when they actually go about and ask people real questions, I think that would really be helpful. And so it would definitely show that the characters that they're writing are definitely well-rounded and then complex characters. And I think just saying that they're just like these static characters is definitely something that, that is not part of happening in like 2022. And so
Yeah.
that's the expectation, or what people have, known from previous writing.
Um, and then my last question was just, are there any books or other resources that you would recommend for writers wanting to do more research into Indigenous people?
Absolutely. I think just exposing yourself to as many writers as possible, because writing, as we all know, is so very, there are so many nuances involved within writing, and so many amazing perspectives that people bring. Just today, I was listening to this presentation from this writer who works with a college in in northern Arizona, and she explained things in such a way that I've never heard before. I've seen people, for example, I've seen the butcher, and I haven't really been full on as involved as she was, in talking about butchering. But the way that she connected, like pedagogy, like the way that things are taught, and then the style of like butchering, it was great. It was such an eye opener that I haven't heard anybody talk about those particular ways before. And I really want to read her work and just see how she actually did that, and talked about those different things, because she had such a dynamic way of speaking about things. And then of course, like, so many different ways that we can see within writing, that people write things down and then talk about things. And there's so many different ways of that. And so I think it's just great to kind of just read different things. When my daughter was really young, I would her play area, and like when she would go to like to story time at the local library, it was right next to the young adult section. So it was great, because like every week I would pick up like a new young adult book and just read through it, and it was just so good. And I became a fan of like young adult fiction, and not that I was opposed to it before. It just wasn't part of what I was reading. And that entire genre is just great. So just looking at the way that people talk about so many different things, if it's like a post-apocalyptic experience, or people that are experiencing things within like our current life, um, how they come about doing that is just great. So I think the more exposure that people can have in writing and reading a variety of different types of writing and looking at the different styles, I think that would be extremely important.
Yeah. Um, so let's see if I'm gonna jump to the chat box. And if anyone has any questions, you can put it in here. So Alicia asked, do you have any recommendations for Indigenous creators to follow?
Absolutely. I think looking at the let's see, what does he call it? It's the in he calls himself an indigenerd, but that's just a very um, that's just the smallest way of like of describing what he's doing. And I will certainly share that. I'm trying to figure out. I know his show is on PBS, Dr. Lee Francis, and he talks about so many things that people don't necessarily think about in terms of like jerky or planting, or um, how things are made, and like the chemical composure of like blue corn mush. And so it's just a great show. And so it really delves deep into like the STEM area. And so did like another book that comes to mind is Braiding Sweetgrass. Her name is Robin Wall Kimmer. And the way she describes planting along with like experiential education, like people going out and like camping and all of that, and then the plants that the people use, it's just beautiful. Actually, when I was reading her work, I'm just like, wow, this is like real prose, and it's just beautiful. So reading that along with a lot of the work from Joy Harjo and Tileya Winder and Byron Aspas, excuse me, and there are so many writers, and just thinking about some of their work, and you can tell when you go into to anybody's work that they write from their perspective, which is extremely important because we all know going into different types of writing that we're going to learn different things that are there.
Mhm. Um, and I wanted to ask, do you mind maybe after this live stream, if you could just send me a list of the names you just mentioned, and I can put them in the description box for anyone watching the replay.
Absolutely, yes.
And then Alicia says, last question. Do you have any Indigenous authors, poets that you love to recommend? Yes, we read Firekeeper's Daughter for our book club last fall by Angeline Booley. And we both loved the book, which Alicia will point out that usually me and her on the opposite ends of what books we end up enjoying, but we both loved this one.
Yes, that is such a good book. I was going to recommend that one. And it's great because we've all read it, and just looking at, and she's definitely talking about the experiences up north. And I love that she's just writing about that, and not, I mean, she does give some background at different times, but she just writes it, and she's puts the responsibility of like the education of like learning about what's going on in the area on the reader themselves, to find out about what's going on in the community and where things are the way that they are. And so the writer Angeline, I love how she goes back and she explains some of the characters within the context that they are currently in, but doesn't give like this full on historical, I guess she doesn't give this huge historical perspective, and so really puts the emphasis on the reader going about and doing that research.
Yeah. Are there any other authors or poets that you know of that you would also recommend?
Absolutely. There's there's one writer of poetry. Well, I mean, there's many, but there's one that comes to my mind today. Her name is Laura Tohi, and she wrote this poem called "The Sacred Tortilla," and we read it every trimester because it's just beautifully written, and the way that she writes about the process of making tortillas and like the science that goes along with that. It's beautiful in the way that it brings in like STEM information, but it also brings in like the idea of like memory and the way that people experience things. And it's just it's one of the authors that I will include in the ones that I sent you, Vanessa.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Alicia said it was her top read of 2021. She's from Northern Michigan.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is such a well done book.
Yeah, it really was.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, we'll kind of start to wrap things up. Let me go back here. So I just want to go ahead and say Thank you to Jodi for being here. And do you have any final thoughts or words that you want to share?
I guess my final thought is I'm really glad that you're doing this, Vanessa. I'm really glad that you are creating this avenue for the exposure, for people to ask questions in this venue, and then I think it's just great. And I think the more that we have these types of conversations, like you've opened up these doors today, that that creates more room for people to not just take up space, but to say like the space that I'm here, it is important, and this is a real person who's standing in front of you. So thank you for doing that, because I think that that helps with people, it really keeping away stereotypes of people that like get perpetuated, and it happens. People just see one thing, like they watch one Western movie and they're like, oh, that's what natives are, and it's like, no, we're still here, and just like other groups of people are, and so it's just important. So I'm glad that you're doing this.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be doing this as well, because it is, important having that representation and having good representation um, on in books and movies, media, different things. I kind of started this because of the lack of representation, um, the positive representation that I've seen in books, and just like what a difference it makes when people feel seen. Um, I've shared in one of my writing groups one time that, like, I think it was the book The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Um, that was the first book I read where I actually felt seen a little bit.
Mhm.
And I don't have cancer like the characters in the book did, but their symptoms from their illness is a lot like my the symptoms for my disability, and so I could relate to the characters in that way. And so I was like, that was the first time I was like, wow, I really, really connect with these
Mhm.
characters and with the story. Um, and so, wanting to have more of that for everyone. Like, so,
Absolutely, that's so important. That is so important. I, I love it when people can put together like memoirs too, and I know that because one of the first memoirs that I had read was Angela's Ashes, and I'm thinking like that is wonderful. You know, I love reading those to like to learn about people and their experiences, and then I also learned that I'm sure that it's this is just his experience, but I'm sure that there's so many other people that have other experiences, and I that need to also be included, that we can all learn from. And learning like that Frank McCourt's version of life that he wrote about in Angela's Ashes, I think that um, just learning to see what people are doing, like when the more recent memoir that I read was Becoming by Michelle Obama, and just reading about how she was talking about different things, and she went back and talking about her life and her experiences, and it was just well done. And I know it's not like regular fiction, because it's nonfiction,
yeah,
but it's just great learning about these different avenues, and I'm excited for where things are going to go.
yeah. Um, I should say thank you, Jodi. I really appreciate what you had to say. I look forward to being able to chat more soon. So,
Same. I look forward to chatting with you too, Alicia.
awesome. So thank you, Jodi, again, for being here today, and thank you for everyone who joined us live and chatted with us today. And if you're watching the replay, thank you for being here. I hope this was helpful and informative to everyone watching. Um, and if you would like to get in touch with Jodi and have more of a one-on-one discussion, just send me a message with your email, and I can get you in touch with her if you would like. So, and if you want to watch more of these interviews, I've done several other ones, and I have a playlist linked in the description below, so you guys can check that out. And I also actually have an online course if anyone wants to learn more about writing diverse characters. That link is in the description below as well. So that's pretty much all I have for today. So thank you again for being here. And I guess I will see everyone next month. Or, well, I'll have more videos up this month, hopefully. So, bye.
Bye. Thank you. Take care.